that I couldn't go.
How can you just pick up on a story like that?
Well, anyway, I got stories, you know, I got all kinds of stories. Anyway, this past Sunday, now if you're gonna talk, I won't tell it. Cause my stories, I don't talk when anybody's talking, tell my story. Anyway, this past Sunday, I went to a small theater off Richmond Road in Lexington. It's called Studio Players. And I've been going there for about 9 years or so. And they did a play called The Miracle Worker. Now, how many in here know who Helen Keller was? Do you know who Helen Keller was? She was born in the early 1900s. She was born normal, and then she had a childhood disease. She had spinal meningitis. And the high fever robbed her of her sight, her hearing, and because she couldn't see or hear, she lost the ability she could make sounds, but she could not speak and make words. So she was about probably 6 years old, and her family had done everything they knew to do they tabbed her all these specialists in the South and everywhere. So they wrote a letter to an institution for blind children. And this institute sent a young woman about 20 years old who was named Annie Sullivan. And what they didn't know when she first arrived was that Annie Sullivan had been in what we call an asylum, which is where they just generally dumped people with all kinds of physical ailments and mental problems. And it was nasty and dirty, and people died there from lack of care, from unhealthy conditions. She had a number of operations on her eyes to get, as much sight back as she could. And then she was sent to a school for the blind. So they sent her out to be this teacher for this young girl. Now, this child was so undisciplined. She was like a little wild animal, just going around in the house, and she was very mischievous. She could really hit hard. She could kick hard. She was smart, though. Oh my goodness, was she smart?
Oh, she's a boxer.
She hit. Are you going to interrupt?
I'm a fighter stick.
Because I'm getting to the good part of the story. Anyway, that child has been portrayed in several movies and in numerous stage plays. And I had the privilege Sunday of watching a 6th grade middle school student portray Helen Keller. Now, I'm talking about a child that for 2.5 hours was on this stage knocking and banging and kicking and screaming like throwing a tantrum. And all the time, what was so amazing about it is she had to pretend to be blind. Now, how many of you think that for 2.5 hours you could lose your focus and not dart your eyes left and right and have a dull look in your face like you were blind? It would be hard for anybody to do that. Now here was a 6th grader, middle school student, that was doing all this physically hard acting for 2.5 hours on this stage. She was picked up, thrown over shoulders. She was grabbed. She was kicking. She was slamming. She was pretending to grab food. And it was amazing what a good job this little girl did. But the truth of the story is that she was portraying an absolutely 100% true story. Now, how do you think that this teacher that came to this child eventually taught her communication? Does anybody have a guess how she eventually learned to communicate? Now, they portrayed this in the play, but in real life, this was a real person. She became a world famous woman, traveled in Europe, wrote books. She learned to read by Braille. She could type in Braille. She went to college. She became educated. Now, how do you think she started learning to communicate? Does anybody have an idea? The only way that she could be taught to communicate was her teacher began the teacher first had to teach her how to sit still, eat with a fork and fold a napkin, and behave like a normal human being because she'd been allowed to be a wild animal. And that was a big struggle. I mean, in one of the scenes in the movie and in the play as well, she worked with that child for 5 hours in a dining room trying to get her to sit up in a chair, so she could actually sit down at a table. and fold a napkin and eat like a normal human being. What the teacher would do, she finally asked the family to remove the child away from home for a period of a week or two and make her think she was far away from home so she would have to depend on the teacher. Now, she didn't like the teacher. The teacher was trying to make her behave. What?
Can I go get my toolbox?
Yes. So anyway,
Can I go with him?
no. What she finally did, guys, and what clicked finally with the child, it was a long battle. She would do the deaf alphabet, but she would spell it into the child's hand. It was called finger spelling. She would spell the deaf alphabet in her hand. That's the only way she could communicate with this little girl. And the movie about it's amazing. The play was just, I was just absolutely surprised, more than I can say, to watch this little 6th grade child do what this child did. And the thing that was the most amazing, any child could figure out how to throw a tantrum, but she never the first time lost her focus in trying to be a blind person. She never looked at anybody. She had that blank stare the whole time she was on the stage. I couldn't do it. That was amazingly hard. But when you get back to the story of Helen Keller, what the teacher finally did, she would give her like a piece of bread or a piece of cake, or let her pump the pump and get water in her hand. And all the time she'd constantly be spelling with the finger spelling. And after a very long period of time, after weeks, the child finally grasped that what she was touching was being spelled into her hand. And from there on, her whole world opened up. Had there not been a teacher like that for this child, that was that persistent and that hard-headed, that child would have been like a little crazy wild person all their life, in behavior. But her whole world opened up just from spelling the name for objects in her hand. And when she learned that the object meant the finger gestures, the deaf alphabet was being spelled into her hand, then she began to learn very rapidly because she was highly intelligent. And she was so intelligent that her teacher, Annie Sullivan was her name, she grew up to be a beautiful young woman. She even had offers to marry. She was even, gentlemen asked her to marry him. She was a very pretty woman. But she grew up to get a college education. She wrote books on a Braille typewriter. And even more amazingly, by feeling the vibrations of the throat. Put your chairs up real quick before you leave. She learned how to talk. That's an amazing story, isn't it?